Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are looking at the language of Matthew 24:29 and following. The sun being darkened, the moon being turned to blood, the stars of heaven falling from sky. And we're looking at the Old Testament source of that language. Remember, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus came because he was to fulfill the law. The Old Covenant, the law of Moses, the Tanakh, was the source and the basis of every single thing that he did. Throughout the entire book of Matthew and all of the Gospels, we are told over and over and over again that Jesus did such and such, this happened to him, or whatever it was, and it happened because the Scriptures said so. The Old Testament Scriptures said so. And so, the Old Covenant was, in fact, the foundation, the source, the spring, if you please, the fountain of everything that Jesus did. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to fulfill, meaning I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. And so, if we try to ignore the Hebraic source, the Hebraic roots, the Hebraic nature of the language that Jesus used in Matthew chapter 24, 29 and following, then we are abusing the text. Just recently on Facebook, when I have appealed to what is known, what the scholars call Hebraic thought, I have been ridiculed mercilessly, scoffed at, condemned. And yet, when I quote some of the world's finest scholars who say that the early church was very quickly removed from the thought matrix of the early Hebrews, and as a result of that, much truth was lost. Once again, I'm just ridiculed. I'm laughed at. Well, you know what? It does not bother me because it's absolutely true. The Hebrews did not think like the Greeks. The Greeks did not think like the Hebrews. And when we start confusing them, we are doomed to misinterpret Scripture. Now, as I mentioned to you over the last couple of videos, Isaiah chapter 24 is part of what is known as the Little Apocalypse. New Testament writers quote from it, cite it, they echo it repeatedly. Jesus himself did. Well, Isaiah chapter 24, as we've already seen, predicted the destruction of heaven and earth. Pardon me. And the reason for that coming destruction is because, as Hosea chapter 8, verse 1 says, they've broken my law, they've transgressed my covenant. Just like here, they violated the law or broken the law, they've changed the ordinances, and they've violated the everlasting covenant. Let me remind you, this is not about someone violating the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is Israel violating Torah, and as a direct result of that violation of Torah, the law of Moses, this destruction of heaven and earth comes. Oh, by the way, there's something very interesting here. In Isaiah chapter 24, and I skipped over it, I shouldn't have, but in Isaiah chapter 24, notice how this destruction is described. Verse 18, it shall be that the one who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit. The one who comes out of the pit and he comes up from the midst of the pit shall be caught in a snare. In other words, it's inescapable. For the window, watch this, for the windows on high shall be open and the foundations of the earth are shaken. Well, I'm sorry, folks, this is taken directly from Genesis and the story of the flood. This is the description of destruction by flood. Now, everybody believes that when God said, I will never again destroy every living creature as I have done, that he means this. He means, well, this time I destroyed it by water. Next time I won't do it by water. I'll just do it by fire. Well, wait a minute. Here's the destruction of heaven and earth by flood. No, it's not a literal flood. It's an overwhelming destruction. Let's look at Daniel 9. The overwhelming destruction shall come in. I just had to point that out. So once again now, don't forget that verse 19 and following, the earth is violently broken, the earth is split open, the earth is shaken exceedingly, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, shall totter like a hut, its transgressions. This is the earth, this is the earth guilty of sin. Is literal, physical earth guilty of sin? Look, folks, in Scripture, as many scholars have noted, there was such an inseparable bond between Israel and the land that when Israel sinned, the land spewed them out. Or the Lord said, the land is guilty of sin. Now, do you take this language literally? Well, you can't. Land is inanimate. Land is non-sentient. Land cannot sin. But the inhabitants of the land did and do. I'm simply pointing out that this is highly metaphoric, figurative language that was never intended to be taken literally. Now, let's go on. At this destruction, then the moon will be disgraced and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. So on the one hand, you've got the utter destruction of heaven and earth, and at the same time you have the Lord reigning on Zion and in Jerusalem before his elders gloriously. Chapter 25 now. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. The prophet is looking at what's coming. He is expressing it in the past tense. It is a prophetic future tense. Past tense. It hadn't happened yet, but it's expressed as if it has. Your counsels of old are faithfulness and true. You have made a city. What city? The city of confusion, the city that dwelt in the midst of the land. Who was that? One more time, Ezekiel 5, 8, and 9. You have made a fortified city a ruin and a palace of foreigners to be a city no more. In other words, just like Jeremiah said at the destruction of Jerusalem at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, he had turned the temple over to foreigners, and the foreigners walked in its hallways and its colonnades. And that's exactly what's being expressed here for this last day's prediction. Lord, you're turning the palace, you're turning the temple over to foreigners. And it will never be rebuilt. Let's see, what do people tell us about the Jerusalem temple? It will never be rebuilt. Just like the Ark of the Covenant, never rebuilt. Therefore, the strong people will glorify you. The city of the terrible nations will fear you. For you have been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat. For the blast of the terrible ones is as a storm against the wall. You will reduce the noise of aliens as heat in a dry place, as heat in the shadow of the cloud. The song of terrible ones will be diminished. And in this mountain, what mountain is that? Jerusalem, Zion. The Lord of hosts will make for all the people a feast of choice pieces, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of well-refined wines on the lees, and he will destroy on this mountain the surface of the covering that is cast over all the people, and the veil is spread over all the nations. He will swallow up death forever. Do you catch the power of this? At the destruction of heaven and earth, at the overwhelming flood of destruction of the people that dwelt in the city that sat in the midst of the land, that would be at that destruction. The city is destroyed, the temple turned over to foreigners, but the Lord prepares the Messianic banquet, the Messianic wedding banquet, and the resurrection takes place. Heaven and earth is destroyed. the kingdom and the resurrection takes place. But remember, folks, it's at the time of the destruction of the people who dwelt in the city, in the midst of the land. And that destruction would come as a direct result of the fact that this people dwelling in the city that sat in the midst of the land had violated the law, broken the law, changed the ordinances, violated the everlasting covenant. It's not talking about the gospel, not talking about sin against the gospel. It's called Old Covenant Jerusalem in violation of the law of Moses. Well, that's going to be enough. Well, it's not enough, but that's all I'm going to do on Isaiah 24. Next week, we will continue our examination of this language of the destruction of heaven and earth, showing the language is purely metaphoric, purely figurative, never literal. And don't forget, tomorrow we will continue our refutation of the book, Hope Resurrected by Lance Conley. We'll continue our examination of his incredibly illogical claims about the time statements of Scripture. You don't want to miss it, so I'll see you on the flip side.